And welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Matt Confer. Matt is the strategy lead at Ability, which is a really interesting organization that helps organizations utilize their team-based simulations to enhance leadership development. So a very specific, very niche type organization using simulations for leadership development. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can talk about today. Matt's an interesting guy in his own right. He was at Deloitte earlier in his career, and he has an MBA from BU. So welcome aboard, Matt.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, so let's just sort of, this is going to get really nichey today based on your expertise, which I think is kind of fun. But, first let's describe from a learning efficacy perspective what a simulation is and why it's ultimately one of the better mousetraps when it comes to adult learning.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. One of the things that we talk a lot about is when you look at certain fields, throw out the healthcare field or the aviation field, you've got pilots and you have doctors and nurses who, in many ways, train by doing. We do not want our pilots, getting ready for the landing, or our surgeons getting ready to cut into us without actually practicing by doing, not just watching PowerPoint slides or reading
Right,
a book.
right.
And so our belief is, how can you simulate for corporate leaders? Because many of the decisions that they make, although maybe not being as life and death, should have an experiential learning component to them.
So that's great because I mean, theoretically, I could be a great pilot. I wouldn't trust me to fly a plane, right? I could watch a lot of YouTube videos and all that other sort of stuff. And again, in the medical profession, so the question is, we know that simulations are deployed across those fields where it's high stakes, literally life and death, et cetera. And now what we're learning, sort of in the collective, is yeah, there's a place for theoretical learning, but what we want our frontline managers to do, what we want our leaders to do, is in an applied setting, in a real setting, implement what we're teaching them in ways that are logical and help them do what they need to do better, right? So how does one determine? So, we work with lots and lots and lots of authors, thought leaders, and speakers from all around the world, right? And there's certain content that I can see would be obvious and logical, maybe sales training, certain leadership development, giving feedback, etc. How do you at Ability go about determining if a specific slice of content would fare well in a simulation setting?
Yeah, so at the current time, we focus on three core tenets of leadership training. Not to say that we won't or aren't in the process of getting into other avenues, but the three that we focus on are: first is management. So we have a simulation that is all about managing virtual employees in this instance. The second is all about financial acumen. So we have a simulation that is basically, you can read about balance sheets, you can do case studies about income statements, but until you're making financial decisions and seeing the impact on the bottom line, it potentially might not resonate. And the third simulation that we offer, the third bucket that we really get into, is strategic cross-functional leadership. So it's great to talk about how matrixed organizations have trouble sharing between different departments, but we actually have a simulation that helps to actually put leaders in stressful situations where we disseminate different pieces of information to different departments and see how they strategize a correct approach to formulating the correct path forward.
Yeah, that's interesting because I can only imagine, for example, in the strategic cross-functional element, almost an infinite amount of variables that come into play. And then I say, yeah, but that's the real world, right? So there's cultural nuance, right? There's currency fluctuation. There's one market likes things a certain way. So how does one go about sort of embedding, I'm sure you can't get infinite possibilities, but all of the variables there, because the litmus test of a true simulation is, does it feel like something that's real?
Yeah, the way we do it for that simulation, which we refer to as our executive challenge simulation, the cross-functional simulation, basically we break the group into four teams. And the way the simulation is pitched, it is a technological experience, but you are in the classroom with your teammates. And we pitch it as, we are a venture capital company that has come in and given four teams capital in the realm of dollars and also capital in the realm of human capital in the
Sure.
simulation. And your team is required to build a company strategy from the ground up. We give you a product portfolio that you can bring to market. You
Okay.
must make trade offs to decide which product to bring to market. Each department has 12 virtual employees, and you need to balance their engagement. And we also give you the capacity to actually invest in training your virtual resources. But if you are not careful, the simulation also tracks employee engagement, and you can actually lose your virtual employees to the other teams in the game. So you can kind of envision a scenario where you've invested in training your resources, much like the real world, but you have not balanced the engagement of overworking them. And the simulation reflects that. And there is a dynamic hiring pool in the game. So we are trying to simulate the balancing act that most leaders at organizations have to deal with.
I love that because the reality is you can put a great team together, you can allocate your resources effectively, but if you're not tuned in as a leader to your employee engagement and you start to lose your high potentials, that's a game changer in terms of the probability of you achieving the desired outcome on budget, on time, etc. Let me ask sort of a different question or different thought. How does this play out when deploying simulation based training cross generationally? Right? Is it that the Gen Ys and the Millennials are more comfortable because it's virtual and maybe the Boomers not so much? Is there any difference cross generationally?
I think when we talk about three of the core tenets of I guess, one, why we think we've been successful, and two, why a lot of companies come to us, is tenet number two on that list is that today's learners and tomorrow's future leaders really grew up with games, and there was a competitive element to a lot of what they did. And as a result, they really demand a lot more than just PowerPoint slides. They want to get into the nitty gritty. And so, yes, do we see an uptick in a lot of companies that are potentially have a growing millennial workforce? I think that's a very fair assessment. But what I really like about the classroom or virtual experience when you're delivering a simulation is the leaders that are later in their career can share real world examples of what they're struggling with or what they're succeeding with in the simulation and tie it back to an example they had from earlier in their career. And as a result, younger leaders actually benefit from tying the simulation back to the experience that their colleagues have had earlier in their career.
So that's a great point. So I want to make sure I got that properly. So an outcome of the simulation might be that it stimulates a memory or recollection from someone that's maybe a little bit more senior of a situation that is analogous to whatever they saw in the simulation, but in the real world. So at my previous job 12 years ago, these three variables exactly happened, and here's how we played our hand, and it worked out well, or it didn't work out well. Is that fair? Is it to recap that?
It hits it right on the head. And I think in our people management simulation, I have a colleague who does a really good job talking about, above all else, what it does is it gives the learners in the room a shared language. So if you've
Sure.
been dealing with 6 employees virtually throughout the course of the day, during one of our debriefs, almost inevitably somebody will stand up and say, I have a gym on my team, or
Yep.
3 years
Yep.
ago, I managed a gym. And here's what was really successful in that instance. And now I have more of a safe environment to share some of my opportunities for improvement based on what I've done in the past, and also maybe talk about some of the things that worked really well.
So what's interesting about that, or there's lots of interesting things about that, but one thing that sticks out is there's the learning that happens in real time as you're allocating the resources, making decisions, you get real time feedback, et cetera, et cetera. But you mentioned the debriefing. So this isn't just something that folks do in isolation in an asynchronous way. How does that converge where everybody's doing a simulation and then there's debriefs to share knowledge and why did I make this decision and how might I have done that differently or I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, there are a couple of core tenets that permeate all of our simulations. One, they're all team based. We do not go to market with a single player
Got it.
option on the front end. Two, they all have a competitive element, and that's to bash out the distracted learner component that I think really goes across a lot of corporate learning today. And three, they always have a facilitator that leads debriefs after every quarter of gameplay. And so it's about tying back to the real world, because in the simulation, we're in many ways trying to pull you out of the real world to give you a sandbox to practice.
Right. So there's a blended element to this, which I wasn't aware of, where we're going to do these simulations in teams, and then on a regular cadence, I think you said quarterly there, we're going to debrief the results, the outcomes, how things happened. Is that right?
Yeah, so most of our simulations are built to be basically anywhere between 6 to 10 hours of total content. Most clients choose to run it as a day long activity. And so over the course of a day, you might play anywhere between 4 to 8 quarters or months of simulated gameplay. But after each quarter or month of simulated gameplay, we actually have debrief curriculum built to tie it back to your real world. So it's about getting you in and out of the simulation and keeping you kind of in constant motion and constant engagement.
That's awesome. So let's do a little bit of a compare and contrast if we could, right? So for example, if I were a learning executive or learning and development person tasked with teaching this band of employees financial acumen, there's a suite of tools I can go into, right? Here's go read this book, go take this class, here's a workshop, download this, right? Here's some tools, whatever, whatever. And then there's all the usual issues that come into play, compliance, and people get busy and they don't follow through, and are they distracted, et cetera. Can you give me sort of the compare and contrast, maybe use the financial acumen one or not, of why what you have is a better mousetrap measured through the lens of outcomes, of actually, because we're all in the learning business, because the promise is people will learn to do something. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, and I think the way I speak to it is the vast majority of our clients choose simulation based learning or broadly experiential learning as the capstone. And the reason they do that is the pilot doesn't get in the simulation right away. The pilot learns from other pilots, potentially reads literature, goes through more
Right.
rudimentary training, and then to put that into practice, to basically bridge the gap between theory and lessons and practice, that's where the experiential learning comes in. So we by no means are a panacea or a just throw people into a simulation and hope things work out. The best experience is if you're doing a new manager program and you have 1 week of content or 3 months of content, contemplating utilizing experiential learning to end that activity and reinforce and tie back to the lessons you have been teaching potentially is the way to absolutely reinforce what has been taught.
Got it. Got it. So there's a huge mix. So you might have a prereq that says, hey, you do need to read these things before you go into a simulation, because I don't need to simulate, what an asset versus a liability is. There's some basic concepts that people could get on their own. Interesting. Interesting. Could you speak a little bit to the outcomes, efficacy, and how we know that this is a really good mousetrap, if you will?
Yeah, I think the biggest one above all else, I mean, we do surveys, we track performance. We try to be an open book in terms of we're very confident in, at some level, a lot of people come to us because they're somewhat disappointed with their learning options, and the feedback that they get on learner surveys is, yeah, it was great, but I felt like I was just clicking through in e-learning and the knowledge was great, but I don't really feel like I grew my network. I don't really feel like I put anything into practice. So in many ways, success for us is a fully engaged learner throughout the course of the experience. And when a clock is ticking down and you have teammates depending on you, I got to be honest, it's just really hard to pick up your iPhone and check your company email, your personal email, or your social media accounts, because you've got teammates
Sure.
that depend on you. And as a result, you now have a larger network in your corporation to bounce ideas off of 2 to 3 weeks in the future. and you can talk about that shared language. So
I love that.
the capacity to put things into practice and grow your network, I think, is where we see the biggest ROI when our clients come back to us next year and say, we really need to do that again, because that's the feedback that we got.
I love that. So, are the learning teams actually intact teams or not? Or does it matter?
It actually doesn't, and we've seen it work successfully both ways. One way that we've seen it work unbelievably successfully is we have some executives who come in and this is the first thing they do with their new team.
Oh, okay.
A la, I want to get into the weeds and I want to learn how my team operates under stressful and conditions of ambiguity. Let's all get in a room, do a team builder, and work together in a competitive environment. We've also seen it where, this is a capstone experience for a 60-person cohort that's been working together for the past 3 months. And this is the culmination of a ton of hard work that's gone into getting them there.
So your approach is a bit modular, where you can plug into a high pro program or a leadership development program or whatever, and make this one element amongst many that the organization might have deemed as important for that population.
Yeah, and when you hit on it a little bit in the introduction, I come from a consulting background. And so one of the things that has blown me away about the learning and development space, the training space, the leadership development space is the amount of heart and effort that goes into designing some of these programs, and the people at companies and universities who are tasked with doing it believe so wholeheartedly in the power of learning and development that many times we have incredible assets at our disposal because these people have built incredible networks at their companies, and they get to help us design some incredible experiences.
Well, that's awesome. So as we start to wind down a little bit, let me ask you to give sort of maybe two pieces of advice to two different populations. So to the one population would be to a L&D professional that hasn't deployed simulation, what they should be thinking about. And then the second is any thoughts to authors and thought leaders and people that create great content on things that they should be thinking about as it relates to porting their content into some sort of a simulation platform.
I think the first thing that I would say that's overarching is we've definitely entered an era where people and learners are demanding something more than slide decks and click through trainings. Not that there isn't a space for that, but at some level, if you're asking people to take time away from their day jobs and the bevy of requests that we are all getting inundated with, you really have to make the experience worthwhile, and putting things in place that they can actually test their aptitude and enhance their skills and see an immediate impact is hugely valuable. So obviously I'm a huge proponent of experiential learning.
Yep.
And I think the second thing, more for the authors and thought leaders, is learning from failure is one of the best parts about what I get to do. I love watching teams succeed, but part of what I tell to potential clients is the people who might get the most out of it are those teams that actually don't end up, quote unquote, winning the simulation. Because by the end of it, you learn some of your leadership weaknesses and blind spots by the very nature of what the simulation uncovers.
I love it. Great. And to the thought leader, to the author?
I think to the author, what I would say is what is fascinating about what we get to do is we get to take some of the things that have previously been reserved for more of those life and death situations and put corporate leaders in that state. We have one external event, what we call it in our executive challenge simulation, where the teams are presented with a potential impending weather issue. And they need to decide who to evacuate and how to communicate this to the team. Some of the most interesting discussions that we get after it is how you balance business priorities based and human capital and the morale of your team. And I think opportunities for authors and thought leaders to push the envelope and get people in more stressful situations, I think you'll be blown away by what people come up with.
Well, that's awesome. I want to thank you because this is a very cutting edge, technologically enabled way to get people to learn better. And your firm is proof in the pudding that it works. And I think this side of the market is clearly where it's going. And I think if you're not embracing it either as a training and development professional or as a content person, you need to at least become aware of what's going on and learn a little bit about it and figure how it could play into your world. But thanks so much for joining us today, Matt. I really appreciate your time.
Peter, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.